Welcome back, pet parent. This has to be the most excited I have ever been for a new episode, and I can't even wait. Dr. Ian Billinghurst is a retired veterinary surgeon, but you probably know him as the father of raw feeding, and he has been so gracious to join us today to answer some questions that I hope will help you guys in feeding your dogs and cats. So thank you so much, Dr. Billinghurst, for being here with us today. How the heck are you?
Well, thank you, Jessica, for that lovely introduction. As well as I can be at this advanced age and never eating properly as I should.
I understand that. I cannot tell you, this past week, I will admit I have eaten way too many goldfish, which are like those tiny little cheddar crackers that we have here that I know contain way too much glyphosate, but it's just what it is for me this week. I'm trying to eat healthy outside of the handfuls of glyphosate-ridden grain that I'm eating in between.
Well, our grandson has been around, and my darling wife, who also cooks lots of lovely food, and I eat way too much of it, she has bought him these lovely chocolate things and sweeties. And of course, at the end of the day, when you just feel like something sweet, they are far too big a temptation. But anyway, here I am, still going, more or less, and happy to answer any questions you might have.
Yes. Well, somebody may have, if you're watching the video, noticed one of my cats kind of peeking in. Her name is Samantha. She might peek around every once in a while. I call her Sis or Sissy. She's 17 years young, but she's not doing too great right now. I think I actually told somebody recently it happened so quickly, almost overnight. And I was like, you know what? But I think that's the best way. Like, they live an amazing life for so long. And then when they do go downhill, it's pretty quick. I think that's the best way for it to happen. So she's getting to do.
We've seen that so often with our own animals. One moment they're smiling and happy. Next minute they're heading off just to lay down somewhere quietly and go away from us. They no longer want to interact. They no longer want to eat.
Yeah.
It's a terrible time for us to witness, but as you say, it is the best way. They haven't suffered years of being treated with drugs and tests and all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
They have made them. They know it's time, and we have to accept their decision.
That's what I'm trying to do with her. But in the meantime, she's getting to do whatever she wants, which often means walking across my computer. So.
Of course.
So you are the father of raw feeding, and that is the primary reason why I wanted to have you on. I like to bring different viewpoints on this podcast. Most of my listeners are what we call 2.0 pet parents, which I don't know, maybe Rodney Habib coined that, I'm not sure, but they know enough to know they want to do better for their pets. I am a huge raw feeding advocate. I actually took your Billinghurst Institute course, which was wonderful. In my messaging on social media, try to talk about fresh food as much as possible to include as many people as possible. But I really do have, in my heart, raw feeding is what I do believe is the best for our pets. So I know, having taken your course, and of course, anybody that's read your books knows that a little bit about the history of how you started this whole movement many years ago. Can you just kind of briefly catch anybody up who may not know the history of how you decided that this is how dogs and cats should be eating?
Well, it goes back a long way. I did agricultural science before I did veterinary science, where I learned about the nutrition of farm animals and the fact that farmers want healthy pets, and most of the time that means healthy food and the right food and all of that stuff. But then I didn't want to continue in that. I really wanted to. I was out as a young man, 21 years old, doing something I could not do now. We didn't have a lot of money, and I was living out in the woods or the bush, as we say in Australia. And to feed ourselves and our families, we were hunting a fair bit, mainly rabbits, which were pests at that time. So we were feeding ourselves and our one dog our one dog also would eat all sorts of things like we had young children at the time, like baby poo and all that stuff. Now, I didn't have a clue about feeding dogs. But this young lady, Candy was her name. She was a Kelpie. She taught me everything. Anyway, I moved from the bush, eventually went back to study veterinary science, long story. But during that process, I thought, oh, I will learn really how to feed dogs and cats. But unfortunately, the bottom line, even back then, and this is in the 1970s, was feed a complete and balanced commercial pet food and everything will be fine. We were taught that. This is what you have to tell your clients. Now, I'd never done that. So when I became a young vet, I was really a little bit confused in my own mind. I told people what we did and what the veterinary profession said they ought to do. Anyway, the family ultimately decided something I never wanted to do, which was to go into shows, breeding and showing dogs. We had, what do we have? We had Rottweilers. That's the ones we were showing at the moment. Oh, and poodles. Anyway, they decided that's what we wanted to do. And they said, but since we're going to show dogs, we now have to feed them properly. So they will be absolutely magnificent. So we started to feed them what we had been taught at vet school. And for the next 2 years, our dogs went downhill. Nothing major at first. Their coats now started to look awful. They started to smell. For the first time, they were actually getting wormy and had external parasites. Now, we'd never had these problems before. They had ear problems. We started to get reproductive problems, and some of our dogs reacted badly to vaccines. So all of this was happening for the first time to my own dogs. Now, I was studying veterinary science. I was studying acupuncture. Already studied veterinary science. I was studying acupuncture at the time and met a lot of these really kooky people who were into things like, they were into herbs, they were into Reiki, all sorts of stuff. And one of the ladies I met at that told me about the fact that she was using raw food. And as she spoke about it, I realized this was what we had always done, and she was extolling the virtues of it. Anyway, I went back to feeding my own dogs this way, and I started to recommend it to clients. Well, the changes I saw were incredible. So then I started to research food. One of the things I researched, just one of them, there were many things. I looked at literature research. One of the things I looked at was countries like Australia, over the years, Taiwan, China, New Zealand, where raw food had recently been introduced. Now, these were epidemiological studies, and I noted that from the time the raw food was introduced, there was a complete change in the disease pattern. The diseases that were eliminated very quickly were 4 very simple diseases of excess and deficiency. The all-meat diet for dogs, the all-fish diet for cats, and the all-liver diet for cats. And without going into the details, these all disappeared overnight. And the pet food industry had hailed this as a wonderful benefit to the pet-owning public and to the animals. But what happened over the next few years, and it happened slowly, this commercial pet food, this is an epidemiological study, animals eating the commercial pet food slowly began to develop degenerative disease processes, things they had never developed before. This inflammatory bowel disease, autoimmune disease, severe arthritis, escalating kidney failure, and escalating cancer. Now, this happened so slowly that the profession generally accepted it as a normal part of the aging process in these countries. And it's been accepted that way ever since. But wherever this food was introduced, this followed the same pattern that I saw with my own animals. I never got to the degenerative disease process, by the way, because I stopped it. But this is how the whole thing. So back in those early days, I thought, how do I tell anybody about this? I actually went to a forum in Australia to tell my profession what it was all about. Zero interest, just absolute silence. I thought the only people I can tell are the general pet owning public. So I thought, well, I can't write a scientific book. Nobody reads those. I'll write a very simple book. So I wrote Give Your Dog a Bone. And my children at the time said, well, Dad, that's still far too long and complicated. But anyway, but away it went, and it has gradually made a difference. But we still have a profession now where they are still trained by the pet food companies, even more so, and the pet food companies push back even harder against raw food. And they still use those same 4 problems of deficiency and excess to persuade young vet students that raw food is dangerous, unbalanced, and should never be fed. And they also, of course, use bacteria and bones as well. So the three things: bugs, bones, and balance. They're the things that they use to scare young vets who are very captive minds and now become hardwired to become salespeople for commercial pet food for the rest of their lives. So that's a potted history of this whole situation. But I'm pleased to say we now have things like a Raw Veterinary Society, started in England by Nick Thompson, and a huge interest amongst a growing number of vets for raw food and understanding that this is what our pets were actually designed to use by evolution. And this is the point. If you have for example, if you have a car, use the manufacturer's spare parts, the servicing schedule, the oil, the fuel, all that stuff. If you use those, your car lasts a long time. If you don't, your car breaks down early. Same thing with our dogs and cats. They're breaking down early because we're putting in the wrong fuel, spare parts, etc., etc. That's been my, I guess, the passion of my life, apart from my family and also looking after my clients. That's been the passion of my life and the driving force that's kept me going. And right now, actually, I'm writing a revised version of Give Your Dog a Bone. I think it's going to take me some time because there's so much more to include now.
I love it. I can't wait for that. I actually have two things to follow up on with what you just said before we move on. The first, I'm curious what your thoughts are on this because of what we have witnessed for so long as pet parents and what you just said about veterinarians being basically indoctrinated by big pet food companies. Colgate-Palmolive, which is Hill's Pet Nutrition, just purchased a raw food company in Australia. It isn't a raw food that I would have liked to feed my dog because it was one of those, here's some food and we added a premix to it kind of thing that I don't love. But, they're seeing these big pet food companies. I think they're seeing that raw feeding isn't going anywhere. They're either going to have to get on the bandwagon or just push harder in their marketing against it. And I'm just so curious to see how what they're going to have to tell veterinarians is going to change over time when they're now purchasing a raw food pet company to, I assume, get in the market. I don't know.
Are you able to say what that raw pet food company is? I'm not aware of it.
Prime 100, I think.
Okay, okay. That would account for the enormous amount of advertising being done by this particular company.
Mm.
I watched it and I thought, my goodness, how can this company afford such an enormous level of advertising? Now I know. I have a lot of thoughts about this, but I'm not going to say too much because I can't speak about a specific company for fear, obviously, of litigation. So I'm not going to say any specific company. But yes, I don't know what they're going to tell vets. Maybe they won't reveal the fact that they actually own this. I don't know. Vets may not realise that they own it. It'll be interesting. Now that you've told me that, I will watch this space with interest.
Yeah, well, I've talked to some of my colleagues in the industry, and I'm like, so many, not all, as you said, there are a growing number of veterinarians who are interested in raw feeding, but the ones who are really indoctrinated into you have to feed this bag of food or your pet is going to die. Like, I can't tell you how many times, it's been told to me by a veterinarian that you're going to kill your pet if you don't feed this food. And it's almost like, are you a hypocrite now? Like, what do you even tell these people?
I don't know. It's really not advertised as raw food. It doesn't even look like raw food.
Doesn't
it? Comes out as a kibble.
Does it?
And the
it looked like a
advertising.
log, I thought, when I looked it up.
Well, the one I saw.
Heard of it.
Yes, the one there. I had very early on I had been sent some samples, and it was a kibble type thing. But you're right, it's a log. And I don't even know whether it's cooked. I don't know. All I know is that there is a young lady who says she's a veterinarian. I suspect, well, she may be. I don't know whether she's a veterinarian or an actor. And it's a single protein source. And I thought to myself, well, that instantly tells me you don't know anything about raw feeding because we want variety, and single protein source would be when you're trying to define or to find out what a dog or cat is allergic to.
Mhm.
That's so I thought, I don't. I just, there's so many questions go through my mind when I see that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But everybody, I suppose people believe, for example, that mixing up protein, some people believe, is a bad thing, and so you can't do it. I think, you ever witnessed a dog? Will a dog say, "Oh no, I can't. I can't eat that. It's many different proteins at once." I mean, crazy. That has never happened in the whole history of the evolution of the dog.
Actually brings me to my next question, about how you see how, like, your thoughts on how raw feeding has evolved, because I know, like, social media is at the same time the best thing in the world and the worst thing in the world. And there are definitely people out there that I feel are giving really, really bad information to people in the name of raw feeding. And so I'm curious your thoughts on how this evolution of raw feeding has taken place in your lifetime.
When I wrote "Give Your Dog a Bone," I presented it as exceedingly simple because it is. I pointed out that no meal has to be complete and balanced. The whole diet has to be, or the whole, not diet, let's call it, it's a food program. The whole food program has to be complete and balanced. No, and I wrote in "Give Your Dog a Bone," no dog in the history, or cat, in the history of the world has had a food program where every meal was complete and balanced. That is just absolutely not necessary and an impossibility. Completeness and balance is actually a relationship between the homeostatic mechanisms in a dog or a cat and real food, the food it was designed by evolution to eat. And in that relationship between the food and the basic physiological homeostatic mechanisms, or just the way the dog or cat functions, let's put it that way for simplicity's sake, that relationship ensures that the animal receives all the nutrients it requires. Now, the nutrients it requires are not only the ones we know about, but they're the ones we don't know about and the ones we have not yet recognized as essential. Now, that's a vastly increased number of nutrients beyond what AFCO recommends and is put into and ensured to be in processed pet foods, and which, by the way, are not necessarily available. And because the body stores nutrients. I mean, for example, we've been told that the B vitamins are never stored. Well, of course they are. If they weren't, our mitochondria would fail instantly and we'd all be dead. There is so much misinformation, scientific misinformation, half-truths out there. And so our bodies store nutrients to be used when those foods don't contain them. And we don't need this complete and balanced, and our animals don't either. And I think we're going to find, and I think I have found over time, that attempting to provide that at every meal is actually more against health than for it. And we know that, for example, we know that intermittent fasting, when you're actually starving of nutrients, is actually a good thing because, and we know the secret to long life is maintaining our mitochondria. And this allows the mitochondria to restore themselves. So there was a period when we're completely deficient of nutrients. It's called fasting or intermittent fasting, whatever you want to call it. But what we're looking at here is we have to look, the admonition that each meal should be complete and balanced is simply there because it has to be legally to sell commercial pet food. That's the only reason for it. It's not a biological necessity. Now, what we have today now is, because I'll get back to your question, what am I seeing in raw feeding? Well, we have gurus out in the world today who are making money by selling complete and balanced diets to pet parents who are absolutely scared witless of the feeding an unbalanced diet because they're going to, as their vet said, will kill their dog. I mean, this happens again and again and again. A pet parent will go into the vet, he or she is feeding raw. The vet says, "Oh, this is the most healthiest dog I have ever seen," and asks a very logical question: "What are you feeding it?" Owner cautiously or proudly, for whatever, depending on the situation, says, "Oh, we feed raw." And might start to go, You can't do that. You'll kill your dog. And the vet has just explained it's the most healthy dog they've ever seen. Now, that true story happens again and again and again. But we have this population of pet parents now who are absolutely scared, who want to feed raw and do the right thing. I suspect it might be the right way to feed the dog, but they have this idea in their head that every meal has to be complete and balanced. So we have gurus selling this idea to them. So these people are always dependent on their particular guru and who will pay them constantly to update their diets and everything else. Whereas my whole aim was to set people free. You can do this. It is beyond simple. A 10-year-old child can do it. You can produce a diet beyond far better than any PhD in veterinarian PhD with advanced training in nutrition. It's probably about 100 in the world, and everybody thinks not everybody, but the veterinary profession thinks they're the only people who can actually prepare dog food or cat food because they're the only people with this advanced knowledge. They don't have that advanced knowledge. Nobody has that advanced knowledge. The inherent wisdom of the food itself and the relationship between real food in evolutionary balance and the animal is what produces completeness and balance. And it depends on storage. It depends on this relationship. It depends on the presence of one thing that our profession is scared of, which is bacteria and other creatures that are part of the microbiome that surrounds us, that's inside of us, that covers us, that's in the air we breathe. That as we interact with our dogs and cats, we share their microbiome and ours with them. Fear of bacteria and so on is one of the things that, again, mitigates against raw feeding. And so that's the situation we have today. We have a situation where people are scared to feed raw because they're going to get the balance wrong and maybe they introduce pathogens and all that stuff. And it puts many people off raw feeding, which is really sad because the whole idea is that this is simple beyond, and that's what my course is all about, showing people just how simple it is to feed raw. Once they get that, they're set free. And this is my whole aim: set people free, give them the power. They understand, just like feeding themselves. Well, hopefully they feed themselves properly, but like they never set out to feed themselves a complete and balanced diet at every meal. And there's no reason that our dog should be and cat should be any different. But they don't understand that. It's just a commercial requirement, a legal requirement, not a biological one. Far from it.
Well, it is. And for me, like, I hate so much, so much. There's so many foods out there that achieve this quote unquote complete and balance, which, like, what even is that? But they achieve it with a lot of synthetic vitamins and minerals, which I think are, more detrimental than anything, especially over time to our pets. But this idea of complete and balanced. There's, AFCO, NRC, FEDIF, these organizations who have said these are the nutrients that every dog needs, that every cat needs in these amounts every single day. And it's mind blowing to me how we even got there. I guess just for what you said, to be able to put a food on the market to say you can feed this to your pet every day for the rest of their life and they're not going to die, basically.
Well, you have to ask yourself, when you go into a veterinarian's waiting room and all these animals are eating processed pet foods and they've all got lining up with these problems that the vet is being asked to diagnose and treat, were they actually safe when they ate this food? Is this truly the norm? Well, as I said earlier, veterinarians believe this is just a normal part of aging, but of course it's not. It's a long way from it. And I mean, I guess hyperthyroidism in cats, for example, that came into being when people started feeding all this canned food with fish in it. But putting all that aside, feeding dogs and cats, this is my message, is absurdly simple. It really just requires you to think about what the animal is. Now, for example, the cat, so simple. Basically, it is an obligate carnivore, so pretty well a complete animal, but not at every meal. It doesn't have to be. If you watch a cat eat, it won't eat the complete animal at every meal. If you've ever had barn cats or bush cats, as we do in Australia out on farms, they don't eat the complete rat or mouse every time. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. They'll pick and choose. And the dog is not an obligate carnivore. The dog is a number of things. One of those things is a scavenger. And as a scavenger, it's coprophagic, for example. It eats poo, feces, droppings. And we had poodles. Sorry. They were poodles. And in the same household, we had cats. And the poodles would raid the litter tray for this beautiful camembert cheese in their eyes, which was actually cat droppings. So this is absolutely normal because, in fact, feces is a brilliant source of nutrition for animals. It's living and dead bodies of bacteria, high quality protein, high quality. It's got essential fatty acids, rich in B vitamins, vitamin K. If it's from a herbivore, it's rich in fiber, a prebiotic, plus the bacteria that go with it, on and on. You can see this, and people would ask me in the early days, I've got a German Shepherd. I'm feeding it the best dry dog food I can to make sure it grows slowly so it doesn't develop hip dysplasia and all that. But you know what? As soon as it passes its feces, it turns around and eats that and seems to prefer it over the dry food. And I pointed out, well, that's because it's more nutritious than the dry food for all the reasons I just gave. And so it has been ever thus. Animals who eat raw meaty bones, around about 60% of the diet, 15% offal, with, say, just at the minimum, liver, kidney, and heart. Another 15% raw crust vegetables to imitate the gut contents. Maybe some things that are fermented, like sauerkraut or kimchi or kefir, or what I've recently become involved with is beautiful product, Gussie's Gut, where the vegetables are fermented, and simple things to mimic some of the foods. We're not going to feed our dogs feces, but because they're rich in essential fatty acids, we might throw in some krill oil, maybe some kelp and or alfalfa, both of which are very high in trace minerals. And when we do something as simple as that, the food we feed is far more, in its relationship to the homeostatic mechanisms of the animal, far more complete and balanced than anything you could ever feed, produced by a pet food company. And lo and behold, they're much healthier. But you don't have to get yourself tied up in knots over complete and balanced or any of that stuff.
Glad you brought up Gussie's Gut. I was going to bring it up. I mean, I've had Rob on a couple of times now. I think it's a wonderful product. I think incorporating fermented foods is incredible for the gut microbiome. It may not be very easy for a lot of people to do, which is why Gussie's Gut kind of makes it easier for people
That's
to
the
do.
idea.
So what do you think are, because one of the things that we have found, I say we as a community, not me specifically, a lot of today's raw fed dogs, which we've kind of talked a little bit about, the evolution of raw feeding. And I think generally speaking, a lot of people, we think pharmaceutically, we think big pet food, we think in these terms that we've just been indoctrinated with through marketing for decades and decades. So people with food specifically think, I find a food that works for my dog, even if it's a raw food, because they believe in it, and they don't change it. They feed the same thing forever and ever and ever. And so what companies that are out there testing microbiomes of dogs have found is that today's raw fed dogs in the United States, at least, don't have the diversity that other types of dogs eating other things have. And I think that is because they're doing exactly what they've been taught to do by big pet food companies for so long, and that's find what works and don't change it. And so incorporating something like Gussie's Gut can make a huge difference in the microbiome of a dog, even if it's a raw fed dog. So I'm wondering if you would like to expand a little bit on the importance of the microbiome of a dog.
Sure. There's a couple of elements to what you've asked. One is the difference between the microbiome of some raw-fed dogs and other dogs eating something unspecified, the importance of adding, say, fermented material, and the relationship between raw food and the microbiome, and what is the health of these animals that are being fed the single item diet. I don't know the answers to most of those questions. They're the areas that you have to think about. But the most important area is, what is the health of these animals that are, even if they're having a raw food that's one particular company. Is that what you're talking about, that's producing raw food? Yeah. Is it? Or is
Yeah,
it one particular recipe?
I think people get stuck in both. I think people find a recipe online, or they pay somebody to create a recipe and they stick with it, or they find a company or even a recipe from a company and they just feed that for an extended period of time.
Yeah, it would be interesting to know what the health of these animals is compared to, say, a dry pet food animal, and I don't know. And the other thing we really don't have a handle on is what constitutes a healthy microbiome. That is beyond complex to understand, because the microbiome is very much a relationship. Well, it very much depends on what you're being fed or what the animal's being fed, because the microbiome changes constantly in response to the food. Because bacteria, if you're feeding a food that favours one particular type of bacteria, or a group of bacteria, then that's what is going to be predominant in your microbiome. Now, whether that is a healthier microbiome on that food, because we know that the microbiome is involved in digestion, it's involved in immunity, it's involved in mental health. It has this huge effect. Now, we don't know whether this group of bacteria is better than that group of bacteria, is better than that group of bacteria. We do know that animals fed raw are better off than animals fed with processed pet food. But it takes a long time for that difference is never actually noted. This group of raw foods or this group of raw foods is going to produce different microbiome, but will that microbiome in response to these foods produce better outcomes in terms of mental health and so on? So this is a whole area of exploration that we don't really know the answer to. We can document that there's a difference, but then we have to correlate those differences with the outcomes in the animal. And I don't know that we've got those answers yet. We can speculate on them. So what I do accept is the probability that when we feed, and we're watching this actually happen to animals, therefore it's more than a probability. If you feed something like some of the products that Rob is now producing, whichever they are, over time, the outcomes in the animals improves. And this is no matter what they're eating. Why does it improve? Well, they're big questions, but the fact that it does just illustrates the importance of feeding food that mimics the evolutionary situation. And the other thing is that, take humans, for example. Humans living in different climates around the world eat different foods, but their health depends upon them eating a broad range of the foods, local foods in season, that have been there and been nourishing that particular population for a long time. So, for example, the Inuits in the frozen north, they are be a ketogenic diet, I suspect, very much a ketogenic. Maybe not, because there's still a fair bit of protein, but there's a lot of fat in it. I would think that would be pretty well a ketogenic diet, but very high in fat, moderately high in protein, very low, almost zero carbs. Now, those people transferred to the Western diet rapidly develop cardiovascular disease, rapidly, because their bodies have been tuned to eat a different sort of food. But keeping in mind, they would probably do, but we don't really know, if they transferred to a healthy, say, tropical food, if they were transferred to the tropics. I don't know whether that's ever been done or looked at, but because what we find is that people who just eat raw or whole foods, not necessarily raw, but a lot of raw foods and whole foods in season and local, are generally, well, far healthier than somebody being fed the standard American, we could put SAD diet, the SAD diet, standard American or standard Australian diet, whatever you like, causes so much ill health. And we can all attest to that, even over brief periods of time. So it's not the same set of foods that any animal eats. I mean, the humans and the dogs, for example, they coexist together because we're so adaptable. We can move to a different climate, eat the foods of that area and be healthy, move to another climate and still be healthy. Different set of foods, probably a different microbiome, but still functioning to create immunity, good digestion, and good mental health. It's a huge. This is something that we may never figure out because this is something that's been honed over millions of years by evolution, or billions of years actually, starting way back in the primordial ooze, if I can put it that way, with organisms that were not, they were called prokaryotes. And these prokaryotes were organisms that didn't have mitochondria. They remained single-celled. In fact, they remained immortal. And it wasn't until one of these, it was an archaea, as a prokaryote, had an organism that was a parasite invade it, and then instead of the parasite becoming its enemy, became its friend. And over about a billion years, they formed this relationship, which then allowed these modern cells that could form multicellular animals to form, so-called eukaryotes, because those organisms that were parasites became the mitochondria of today. And we have this relationship. But all of these things that allow us to function so brilliantly have taken literally billions of years to evolve. And for us to understand that, we don't have the computing power to even begin to understand it. And to simplistically then say, I can produce a dog food that's complete and balanced with X number of nutrients, and that's it. It is so sublimely ignorant of real science.
I appreciate that viewpoint so much from where you started out saying that, but what is the health outcome of these dogs? Like, that ultimately is the most important data point
Absolutely.
that oftentimes is being overlooked in the name of, look at this cool new thing we figured out, or like that we want to talk about, because gut health is the thing that everybody's talking about now. Is, how healthy is your pet's gut, which
Which we just
isn't,
discovered.
yeah, which isn't a bad conversation to be having, but as you said, like, okay, at the end of the day, what is the health outcome of that animal? That is the most important data point. So I appreciate that very much. I would like to switch gears just a little bit back to raw feeding and your experience in raw feeding, because you have a new puppy. And one of the things that I see with a lot of people in the space I occupy on social media saying that, okay, it is just more difficult to feed a puppy. We have to be more precise while they're in their puppy stages. Feed them a commercial, complete and balanced, and then once they get closer to adult, then we can transition them into, a DIY raw. And I would be willing to bet anything your answer to that is no, it's not that hard. It's not that complicated.
Our puppy tells us what to do.
Yeah.
We have available, I cut up, she's only a little thing. She has grown in the last 3 or 4 weeks we've had her, probably doubled her weight. But I never think about how much or what particularly we're going to feed, because we have available what I call BARF patties. Now, we also have a cat at the moment. Now, the particular ones, when I make BARF patties, they're always different. Depends on what I can find, but they always contain some organ meat, usually liver, kidney, and heart at very minimum. They might contain some pork strips, which are very fatty, some beef, some kangaroo, lots of chicken wings, which are a great source of bone marrow, tendinous material, skin, fat, bones, cartilage, chicken necks, throw in some kelp, some eggs, maybe some yogurt. We can't get Gussie's gut in Australia, sadly, so I can't use that, but that's... So all of those things go in, and it changes every time I make it, depending on what we can find, often on the price of the materials. It's that and chicken wings, and maybe just some straight beef mince, whatever we have. A little bit of leftovers to make her happy, some cheese, some as a treat often, usually that, some liver treats. Okay, so get up in the morning, look, there's some There's some BARF here. It's the patty stuff. It's thawed out. Give her that, for goodness sake. She's absolutely ravenous. I was going to give that to Kat. Doesn't matter. Give it to her. So she wolfs it down. I'm still hungry. I have a piece of a chicken wing. I've jointed the chicken wing. So she wolfs that down. Later on in the day, we might just give her some milk and egg. So we better a egg yolk. I don't give the whites at this stage. Just an egg yolk mixed in with some milk. And sometimes she has it and sometimes not. Gosh, the poos are looking a bit sloppy. I think it was those liver treats. Ease back on that for a bit and just fill her up more with some chicken wings for a few days. You don't think about it, I don't think about it particularly. We just do. It's in our mind that, yes, she needs chicken wings, by the way, or a raw meaty bone of that nature from a young animal or chicken neck. It's almost a completely balanced food, combined with what goes on in the gut with the microbiome, because they produce a lot of the B vitamins that may not be there, the vitamin K. I'm not giving her any omega-3s of any kind. She's growing beautifully. Her brain is beautiful. She's picking up the essential fatty acids from the food she's being fed. She's picking up the protein that she requires. Her body is just working with this food, raw food, whole food. And when she's hungry and she asks for more, we give her a bit more. Probably sometimes she gets overfed and she just goes off and goes to sleep. Sometimes she still remains hungry, but we just go out and play. It is just a natural, organic relationship between us, the food that we know about that contains the things that dogs require, and this puppy. And that's the way you do it. It really is simple. We don't think about it because it's just an idea in the back of our heads. Yes, she requires that. Yes, she requires that. She doesn't require an all-meat diet. She doesn't require chicken and rice. She requires something that very closely mimics over time what an animal, a puppy in the wild might have. Think about puppies in the wild. Once they've been released from their mum's care, they literally become real scavengers and the bottom of the pecking order, and they have to fight and scavenge for whatever they can get. So they grow up hungry and relatively lean. A lot of bones and leftover cartilage from stuff that the adults said, oh, well, I'll eat the better bits like the nice protein. They might have to scavenge the gut contents, fermented food from the kill, all that sort of thing. But I mean, I put it down. I work it out for people. Okay, so for a puppy, again, it's the same diet: 60% raw meaty bones, 15% offal, 15% veg, 10% those other things that I've spoken of, listed out in the books and in the course that you just saw. And then it becomes natural once you understand these basic principles just to do that. As long as you know that it should be raw, it should contain these elements overall, it's a no-brainer. Dogs have eaten this way for millions and millions of years. There's been nobody out there with a white coat and a computer with a spreadsheet saying, uh-oh, it's too much of that rabbit, get that out of your life, It doesn't happen. As long as you're feeding real food in approximate evolutionary balance, cannot go wrong. You cannot.
So you mentioned that you're not adding omegas, and that made me think about one of the things that I'm sorry.
You can do, but you don't have to if you're feeding a broad range of foods.
It made me think about one of the things that my peers and I often talk about, where a lot of the food in the US, and I would imagine it's pretty similar in Australia, developed countries, industrialized countries, a lot of the food in our food supply is not as nutritional as it used to be even 80, 100 years ago.
Yep.
And so when we do look at spreadsheet feeding or using, calculators to try to get to these AFCO requirements, we find that sourcing higher quality foods, especially animal foods, and then local produce where it's not, traveling forever and the nutrition is degrading through all of this travel, we can get much better numbers by feeding higher
What sort of
quality
numbers are we
food.
talking about? What sort of
Well,
numbers?
the numbers, like if we're trying to meet like AFCO requirements type
I
thing.
mean, you get better numbers that equilibrate to AFCO requirements.
Right, which we have
Okay,
already established isn't great.
but they are irrelevant. They are 100% irrelevant to raw feeding, so long as you're feeding the right foods in evolutionary balance, because the body will pick and take out of real food what it requires. So even if that real food has lower levels of what it requires, that animal could not have survived if it didn't have those elements already within the food.
Okay. Yeah.
So they're there in a form that interacts precisely. It's an absolute lock and key mechanism with what that animal requires. The only caveat to that is if this food that is maybe supermarket grade and not biodynamic, organic, if that food has high levels of some form of toxin. That's where the problem lies, not with the quality of the food, because the dog will take what it requires. That's my experience. You can use supermarket food so long as it's a healthy origin. So what we're really concerned with is not so much the nutritional balance inherent in that food. That animal could not have survived if it didn't have those elements within it. It couldn't grow up and be a healthy animal for the farmer. But so long as it's raw and whole, the growing puppy or the adult can take what it needs. And that's one reason that puppies don't actually need anything particularly different to adult dogs, with the one exception that they actually require more bones than an adult dog. Adult dogs can get away with far less bone in their diet than a young pup because they're not forming their bones; they're just simply replacing what's required. So they don't even need that particular ratio between calcium and phosphorus. I mean, that ratio, all of that is absolutely swept aside when you feed plenty of raw meaty bones, no matter what age group you're in. Just don't feed a deficient level of bones to a young pup. This is what's missing, the actual real science of understanding the biology of what is actually going on with our animals. They don't require AFCO levels. They just require real food, because if you feed real food in evolutionary balance, they will get everything they need, even if it's food that is of today's standard, which is of a lesser standard. But I would then suggest, just to be sure, that you do feed a bit of extra kelp and or alfalfa, which is lucerne in Australia, the meal, because lucerne or alfalfa is a plant that sends its roots down about 40 feet into the deep subsoil where it's never been eroded and picks up all those micronutrients. And of course, the kelp is in the sea, all those micronutrients are present and the kelp has them in it. And we don't even have a clue as to how those micronutrients work. I can tell you one piece of research. Well, it was actually a person who spent their whole life on this, looking at the role of micronutrients and in prevention and treatment of cancer. So again, we have no idea, but if we feed real food in approximate evolutionary balance, we don't have to think about anything. All the rest of that, if you'll excuse the expression, is absolute bullshit.
So it's more important, you think, to be avoiding the herbicides and pesticides and toxins.
Absolutely. Yes. That's where the problem lies. As long as you're feeding real food in evolutionary balance, nutritional balance is absolutely fine.
Awesome.
Unless you had some reason to believe that there was something deficient. Now, in some areas, okay, in New Zealand, and this is overcome anyway because they supplement the food of livestock, but there are in some areas that have as a selenium deficiency, and they got what's called white muscle disease. Well, then they started making sure that selenium was out of the food. And so, but of course, those animals never reached the market with white muscle disease, they died. In parts of China, we have so-called cretins because an absolute deficiency of iodine. Again, the food that you feed to your dogs and cats today could not have got where it is on a iodine deficient diet. For example, the chickens that we eat. Again and again, I have to emphasize that these things are not a problem when you feed real food in evolutionary balance, and maybe throw in some kelp and or alfalfa or blueson meal and some sort of probiotic and or fermented food. That's what you need to do. But it is really very, very simple.
So, one more little topic, if you don't mind, if you have the time. I find more often than not, it is some sort of traumatic incident with a pet that leads people down the road of feeding real food to their pets. So oftentimes they're in a situation where their pet has been diagnosed with some disease disorder, and their vet is, of course, recommending a veterinary or prescription pet food. And this pet parent is now like, they're then scared. They are finding fresh feeding and they're like, I want to do this, but they're scared because, as we talked about earlier, their veterinarian is saying, this is what you have to feed your pet now. Like, you can't. So, I feel like I know what you're going to say, but I just want to address it for anybody who is out there, what your thoughts are around that topic.
It's very difficult to put a figure on it, but let's say it's 80 or 90% of animals with whatever disease you care to mention, and it quite often at a quite advanced stage, shift them to real food, and over a period of months, it just quietly disappears. Now, occasionally, there are some diseases that actually require quite a severe modification of even the raw food diet. And that may include any of these things like uroliths. So you may need to feed, if the urolith, which is a bladder stone, develops in, say, a diet with a acid pH, then you have to do something to make it more alkaline, and also remove any elements that might actually contribute to the high level of stone-forming elements within that diet. And that's only a maybe. One other very common example is kidney failure. Now, in kidney failure, we have a situation where the kidneys, because the nephrons, the glomeruli, are no longer around about 75 to 85% or even higher functional, it's not able to carry out a lot of it can't get rid of nitrogenous waste, which come from protein. So you have to lower the protein or do something to get rid of those nitrogenous waste. Now, the simple basis of the the kidney failure diet that I've been using for years is simply to increase the amount of low glycemic index vegetable material in the diet. So you find this is just a matter of increasing fiber from local, or it doesn't have to be, but ideally local and seasonal, low glycemic index foods. So not starchy foods, basically. Anything that's vegetable, highly coloured preferably, above ground, basically, although it can include a bit of carrots, but basically above ground, low glycemic index, non-starchy foods, put through a juicer, then recombine the juice and the pulp. Now, the vegetables have a cellulose cell wall, so the dog cannot digest them. But the bacteria, once you release that cellulose cell wall to be available to the bacteria, now becomes a prebiotic, which is fermented. All the contents of the cell, the enzymes, the proteins, vitamins, everything now becomes available for digestion to the animal. This is the only way that vegetables can become truly useful to a dog, and all as fermented by the animals in the rumen of an animal. And we're trying to mimic that. The way we mimic that is to, not so much the fermentation, but the breaking down by a herbivore, is to put it through a juicer. And this was all described in Give Your Dog a Bone years ago. Put it through a juicer, recombine the juice and the pulp. Now, what happens? All that wonderful juice is fully nutritious, full of phytochemicals, vitamins, whatever. We don't really know. It doesn't matter. Then you have the fiber. The fiber gets to the large bowel and is broken down by the bacteria into short-chain fatty acids, which now feed those bacteria. Those bacteria start to grow, but they need a source of nitrogen to produce their own protein. Where do they get it from? Well, those short-chain fatty acids have increased the thickness of the bowel wall. They've increased the blood vessels coming to that bowel wall. In other words, they've started to nourish the body. And those bacteria take the nitrogenous wastes out of that blood and convert it to their own protein. So we have a situation where the large bowel, at least in terms of eliminating nitrogenous wastes from the body, is acting like a third kidney. And this is the simple physiological basis of the kidney diet. And you can titrate this level of vegetables that you put in the diet. In other words, if you've ever done chemistry, you know titration is a matter of adding something to something else until you get a specific change. So with the specific change we're looking for is a reduction in things like SDMA, BUN, creatinine, as measurements that we would make as you increase the level of vegetable material in the diet to the required level. Now, because you're feeding real food, you can reduce that protein quite substantially in the food because all of the food you're feeding is high in essential amino acids. So this whole thing just works together beautifully. It produces a complete and balanced diet that is actually able to help eliminate the nitrogenous waste from the bloodstream and bypass the kidneys. But at the same time, something else is happening. Because you're feeding real food, and most of these dogs were previously on a kidney-destroying commercial diet, which is what it is, the body now starts to repair. And over time, it actually gets better in many ways, including kidney function over time. Again, real food is very restorative. Whoops.
Okay, so Dr. Billinghurst lost his internet connection, but we had such a great chat. I want to say thank you to him for being here, for giving me his time. It was amazing to get to talk to Dr. B all about raw feeding for dogs and cats and getting into the nitty gritty of some of the more asked questions, especially where raw feeding is concerned. If you haven't looked into Billinghurst, the Billinghurst Institute, I will make sure that that link is in the show notes. I took the pet professional course. There's also a pet parent course. I think one of the things that I want to say about it is that after taking other certification courses, after getting other nutrition certifications, I felt overwhelmed, not in a sense that I couldn't do it. I know I'm a very capable person, but in a sense that, like, gosh, why does it have to be so hard to feed our dogs and cats? And it isn't, and it shouldn't be. And that's the one thing above all else that Dr. Billinghurst gave me through the Billinghurst Institute is that it is not, and it should not be difficult to feed our dogs and cats. A little more so for cats than dogs, being that cats are obligate carnivores. But the reality is that, and I know I have said this before, I may have even said it earlier in the episode, the most research into nutrition has been done on humans, dogs, and cats. The sickest animals on the planet are humans, dogs, and cats. It should not be as hard as we're making it. We are harming our pets and ourselves sometimes with how hard we're making this when it should not be hard. All we have to do, my cat is going to interrupt me. All we need to do is look at how these animals eat in the wild. And yes, can we improve on that? Absolutely. And we should, but it is not the end all be all. We can, sorry, my cat. If you're watching the video, you're seeing my cat continually try to walk on my computer screen. But it should not be difficult. It can and should be easy. Granted, if your dog or cat is sick, there are a lot of other things that we do need to take into account, which is why I still recommend working with a nutritionist. Doesn't have to be me, can be me. I'm happy to help if I have the bandwidth at the time that you need, that you're listening to this and need help. But anyway, I will put a link in the show notes to Billinghurst Institute. There is a pet parent course. You don't necessarily have to take the pet professional course. It's like, gosh, they keep adding to it. It's like, I don't even know what it's at now, like 50 hours of video. It's a lot, but it is so beneficial. The pet parent course is obviously not going to be as much, but still get you, I think, where you need to go as far as like if you are doing a DIY raw, especially, and you're just feeling really overwhelmed, this can help alleviate the overwhelm for you. Of course, Dr. Billinghurst is known as the father of raw feeding. I'm so excited for what he has coming up next. I want to give him another thank you, and thank you, the pet parents listening today. I appreciate you for being here. And please reach out to me on Instagram if you have any comments or questions. I am always happy to talk to you and answer you as best I can. Obviously, I'm only one person, but I'm here for you guys. So, with that, I will talk to you soon. Please give your pets some extra love from me and from Dr. Billinghurst this week, and I will talk to you later.